Hi, welcome to Stories of Art. My name is Karel Huidekoper. Today I'm going to tell you the story of this incredibly famous sculpture called the Pietà by Michelangelo. He made it between 1498, 1499, and incredibly he was only 23, 24 years old when he made it. It is one of his earliest large commissions, and it's the only work that he ever signed. Today it's sometimes hard to imagine that someone like Michelangelo even had early work. We see him as one of the greatest artists that ever lived. He was one of the greatest sculptors as well as one of the greatest painters and architects, not just of his age but of any age. He would become this giant in the world of art and an inspiration to people, not just in his generation but all the way through the centuries, and even nowadays people find inspiration in his work some 5 centuries later. So it can be strange to realize that he too had humble beginnings and he struggled as an artist at first. He started, of course, as an apprentice to a painter named Domenico Ghirlandaio, and he was accepted at the Medici court, where he lived for several years and was partially raised there. And it was at that court that he didn't just study painting and sculpture, but also philosophy and history, and he would start his lifelong fascination with the work of Dante Alighieri. Actually, at some point he would be seen as one of the leading experts of the subject. But at that court he would also learn to write poetry, and it's likely that at some point he saw himself as a sculptor first and a poet second, and then all the other things came after that. But just like everybody else, he had to start somewhere, which meant that he had to search for commissions and had to do smaller jobs in various cities before he got his first breaks, his first big commissions. And one of the earliest successes that he had was making a forgery. The story goes that he had sculpted a sleeping Cupid. At that time he was back at the Medici court after having been away for a couple of years, and Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de' Medici, who was then the big man of the family, said of this Cupid that it was as good as anything the ancient Roman and Greek had ever made. So he suggested that Michelangelo could sell it for a higher price if he made it look older and bury it in Rome, and then he could have it dug up by an accomplice and offer it for sale as an antique sculpture. And according to the story, they actually did this, and the Cupid was sold to a cardinal called Raphael Riario. And apparently Riario found out that he was being deceived, or actually had been deceived, and he wanted some of his money back. Now, this is the story. We don't know for sure if it's true, the whole forgery thing, that is. But what we do know is that Michelangelo had gone to Rome and sold a small sculpture of his sleeping Cupid to Raphael Riario. And then Riario commissioned Michelangelo to make his first larger-than-life full-scale figure, which was this Bacchus, or Dionysus, which is now in the Bargello in Florence. And it was a widely admired sculpture that led to the commission for the Pietà. Because that commission then came from a man called Jean Billière de Logralas, who was a cardinal but also a diplomat for the French crown. Billière had decided he wanted a monument for when he was to be buried, and decided that he wanted to be buried in a chapel right next to Old St. Peter's. Because St. Peter's, as we know it today, hadn't been built yet. Michelangelo would eventually build it, but that was half a century after he made this Pietà. Now, in this case, Cardinal Billière wanted a tomb in the chapel of Santa Petronilla, which was a structure that stood next to Old St. Peter's. This picture is a 19th century reconstruction of Old St. Peter's, which is the church that stood before the current St. Peter's was built. The original St. Peter's, by the way, was built in the 4th century, so by the time that Michelangelo came to Rome, this church had stood there over 1,000 years, and that had started to show. Frankly, it was falling apart, and for decades they had been arguing over if they wanted to restore it or just tear down the whole thing and build a new church. Obviously, eventually they chose the latter. But when they first built the original St. Peter's, it stood in a necropolis, which is a fancy form of a graveyard. There were many large and small mausoleums dotted around this part of the landscape that was just outside of Rome. In fact, the reason St. Peter's was built there is because they thought, and many still think, that the actual St. Peter was buried right there. But when they built it, it was set in between several other funerary monuments. 2 of those were these circular structures that you can still see on this picture, where they thought that some emperors had been buried, although still we're not entirely clear which ones. But these structures were then repurposed to become the sacristy of St. Peter's, and the second one became a chapel where various prominent people were buried, and from the 9th century onwards, many French kings had been buried there. and by that time it was known as the Chapel of Saint Petronella. But with that French connection, it wasn't surprising that Cardinal Billière wanted his monument to be placed there. And so that's what they did. He was eventually buried there, and the Pietà was part of his funerary monument. Later, and by that I mean decades later, when they really started working on rebuilding St. Peter's, first one of these two circular structures was demolished, and then the second. And I think it was the Chapel of St. Petronella that was kept the longest. So that's probably this one in this drawing by Maarten van Heemskerk. So that was what it was going to be made for. And now Michelangelo set to work making his iconic figure out of the best marble that money could buy, which is from the Carrara quarries. By the way, we call it the Pietà. That's because it's so very famous, but technically it's a Pietà, because it's a familiar, regular, normal subject in art. It's a scene that is, of course, not mentioned in the Bible. I've mentioned this in many videos, but in the Gospels, of course, the crucifixion is mentioned and described, and then the plea to bury Jesus and the burial itself is mentioned, but there's nothing about what happened from the moment Jesus died on the cross to his burial. I mean, we assume, obviously, that his body was taken down, but in the popular imagination, scenes like this were added, where the body of Jesus was placed on the lap of his mother, and she laments his death. Over time, it became one of the stages of the cross, stage 13, and it's one of the 7 sorrows of the Virgin. But because it's part of those stages and of the sorrows, it is something that has been depicted quite often, even though as a scene to depict it is quite awkward. Because of course, you want to have a Mary who is of a normal size, who has to sit up, with the body of an adult man sprawled across her lap. And it's incredibly difficult to make that into a coherent scene, which is why it's often done like this. In this version by Giotto, actually called the Lamentation, she can hold his body while it lays on the ground. But when you look at this version, which is from Austria from the 1420s, you start to see how difficult it is to balance this composition. And there are several painted versions like this one by Perugino that show this problem even clearer. I mean, how do you fit a grown man on the lap of a small woman? And that is where we see the genius of Michelangelo, because here we can see that you can actually balance these two things. He managed to make the Virgin Mary hold the body of Jesus in a seemingly natural way. All she has to do is to hold him up with one hand as he lays across her legs. I mean, it looks like such an effortless composition, and that's the reason I showed you the other ones. It is of course helped by the fact that she's wearing billowing clothes, because then so much of her anatomy can be hidden in all of these different folds, because that way he could secretly make her legs a little bit bigger than would be completely natural. And with all these great big folds in clothing, even the priesthood could not be offended by the fact that she spread her legs, because her feet are wide apart, of course. And just look at how brilliantly he made all of those folds in her clothing, and of course the loincloth that Jesus was wearing. Now when we focus on the body of Jesus, Michelangelo made him look quite fit. It is an idealized body. He's very thin but also quite muscular. This particular Jesus was in pretty good shape. And also you can barely see his wounds. The one in his side is just a little line, a scratch. And there's small but clearly visible holes in his hand and his feet. And she only props him up with one hand. And if you look at that hand, under the armpit, you can see that she pushes up because his skin is pushed that way. And this emphasizes that his body isn't responding, it's limp. But it also shows us that she's almost pulling him towards her, as if she's going to hug him in this sort of unsure moment of grief and wanting to hold her child. And that little gesture to me makes it such a moving sculpture. Even more than her face, because that is somewhat unmoving. She isn't crying, at least not visibly. She holds her composure, and in that she is part of the tradition of sculptures and other depictions of the Virgin Mary, where she's not just a mother of a human, but also a mother of God and the Queen of Heaven. And that is what makes this not just a great sculpture, but one of the greatest ever. The fact that he combined a grieving mother and a regal figure all in one. That is what makes this absolutely amazing to me. And it must also be noticed that she is very young. She looks like a teenager. And there's a good reason for that. In literary sources, Mary is often described as being forever young because of her virginity and her lack of sin. And in particular, this is mentioned by Dante. And it's quite possible that that influenced Michelangelo's decision to make her so young and without flaws in her face, and no wrinkles either. Now in 1499 this sculpture was installed in the chapel of St. Petronella, and soon after it was placed there, a famous story from the life of Michelangelo took place. According to the story, and you always have to take stories of Michelangelo with a grain of salt, because he dictated them to his biographers, but the story goes that there were two people standing in front of the Pieta. They were admiring it, and Michelangelo overheard them discussing who made this sculpture, and one of them said that it was Cristoforo Solari, who was another Italian sculptor. And this angered Michelangelo so much that he had himself locked in the chapel that night, so that he could carve his own name on the sash across the chest of the Virgin Mary, which now says Michelangelus Bonarotus Florentinus faciebat, which translates to Michelangelo Buonarroti, the Florentine, made this. Of course, we don't know if this story is true, but it is significant that it's the only work that Michelangelo ever signed, and in his biographies he expressed regret for doing that, because he thought that that was blind vanity. Although, personally, I think it's probably even more vain to assume that everyone will always recognize your work even without it being signed. Now, this sculpture stood in that little chapel for a long time, well, actually for several decades, until the whole chapel was demolished because new St. Peter's was going to be much bigger and needed the space. And I'm actually not sure where it was in between, but at some point in the 16th century it must have been moved to its current location in St. Peter's. And in one of the instances where they moved the sculpture, it was damaged. The fingers of her left hand were broken off. But it wasn't until the 18th century, 1736 to be precise, that was restored. And 4 new fingers had to be carved because the old ones were lost. Actually, that was not the only alteration that was done to it. In the 17th century, Pope Urban VIII gave her a canonical coronation. For that reason, it was to be crowned with a jeweled crown, and for that they drilled 2 holes in the back of Mary's head to fix the crown to her. Later they decided to make 2 cherubs that could carry the crown over her. But luckily they have removed these 2 cherubs. They're now elsewhere in St. Peter's. But we know that at some point, probably at the end of the 16th century, it was moved to New St. Peter's. And nowadays, when you walk into the church and you turn right, you see her in the first chapel. She's placed behind very thick protective glass, which is a pity because you can't approach her very closely, but understandable because she was attacked back in 1972 by a mentally disturbed man. I'm not entirely sure why I have to specify that. I mean, if you attack sculptures like these, you're by definition mentally disturbed, in my humble opinion. But a man attacked the Pietà with a hammer while shouting, "I am Jesus Christ, I have risen from the dead." In English, apparently, as he was Australian. But I'm not going to mention his name because I don't think idiots like that should be mentioned. But he managed to hit it 15 times before someone intervened. And that was done by an American man who I will name. His name was Bob Casserly, who was there on his honeymoon. He later said, and I quote, "I leapt up and grabbed the guy by the beard. We both fell into the crowd of screaming Italians. It was something of a scene." And afterwards it turned out that people in the crowd had taken the bits of marble that had fallen to the ground. Some of these bits were returned later, but notably not her fingers and not her nose. The nose had to be reconstructed, and for that they carved out a little bit of marble from the back of the sculpture. But I take a little bit of satisfaction in the idea that the people who stole these fingers, thinking they were the originals by Michelangelo, actually stole the ones made in the 18th century. So nowadays you can see her, but from a little bit of a distance. But let that not deter you, she's still as beautiful as ever, and if you want to go there, make sure you take a bit of time out of your itinerary, because these days getting into St. Peter's isn't just walking in. There's a lot of security checks and therefore a very long line to wait in. But obviously it's still very much worth the effort. And of course, when you are there, you are already in the Vatican, which is in Rome, so in my opinion you're already winning at life. Now, before you go there, let me remind you that you could of course support this channel. You can do that by liking and subscribing, and you could also share my videos with people you think that might be interested. But you can also support this channel financially by hitting the thanks button just below this video. Any support you can give is very much appreciated. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.